Welcome back to Emma's Stories, where we dive into tales of love, heartache, and the beauty of finding yourself. Today's story is called Stepmother Mocks Her as Pathetic and Forces Marriage to a Beggar Unaware as a Billionaire. It's a journey of pain, discovery, and a romance that blooms where you least expect it. So grab a cozy blanket, settle in, and let's begin. Clara Evans was 29 years old, a woman who had built a quiet life for herself in the bustling city of Boston. By day, she sold houses, guiding families into their dream homes with a warm smile and a knack for finding just the right place. But beneath that smile was a dream she had buried long ago, the dream of holding a paintbrush, of splashing colors onto a canvas, of becoming an artist. That dream had faded 5 years earlier, when her father passed away, leaving her alone with her stepmother, Margaret. Clara had stepped up, pouring every spare dollar and every ounce of energy into keeping Margaret afloat. She paid the bills, covered medical costs, and even worked late nights to make ends meet, all while Margaret watched with a cold, judgmental eye. Clara lived in a small apartment overlooking the Charles River, a place she had made her own, with thrift store furniture and a few sketches pinned to the walls. It was her sanctuary, a refuge from the weight of Margaret's constant disapproval. She told herself it was worth it, that family meant sacrifice, that love sometimes came with sharp edges. But everything changed one Sunday night in early spring, when Clara was away at a real estate conference in Providence. She was curled up in her hotel room, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone, when a text from her cousin Lily popped up. It read, "Clara, you need to see this. I'm so sorry." Attached was a link to Lily's latest live stream, part of her quest to become a social media star. Clara clicked it, expecting a glimpse of the family dinner she had missed. Instead, what she saw made her chest tighten and her breath catch in her throat. On the screen, Margaret sat at the dining table in Clara's childhood home, a glass of wine in her hand, her lips curled into a smirk. The camera, held discreetly in Lily's lap, caught every word. "Oh, please," Margaret scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Clara thinks she has something special with her little house-selling job. She couldn't even keep a man, let alone succeed in life. She is pathetic, a desperate failure wandering through life with nothing to show for it." The room filled with laughter, her aunts and uncles chuckling as if it were a grand joke. Then Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "I've had enough of her delusions. I've arranged for her to marry some filthy beggar I found downtown. Maybe that'll teach her where she really belongs." Clara stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The words echoed in her mind: pathetic, failure, beggar. Each one was a dagger slicing through the fragile hope she had clung to for years. She pressed pause, unable to watch another second, and sat there in the dim light of her hotel room, tears welling in her eyes. In her mind, she whispered to herself. I sat there staring at my phone, my chest tightening as her words stabbed deeper than any knife. 5 years of pouring my heart into her care, and this is what she thinks of me? Pathetic? Maybe she's right. Maybe I have been fooling myself, thinking love or dreams could ever be mine. She replayed the last 5 years in her head. The late nights arguing with insurance companies to cover Margaret's prescriptions. The weekends spent driving her to appointments instead of sketching by the river. The savings account she had drained to keep Margaret comfortable while her own dreams gathered dust. Clara had told herself it was duty, that Margaret was family, that her harsh comments were just tough love. But this was no tough love. This was betrayal, raw and unfiltered, broadcast for the world to see. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Lily. "I'm so sorry, Clara. I don't know she'd say that. I was just filming for my followers. Do you want me to take it down?" Clara hesitated, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. "No," she typed back. "Leave it up. I need it." She don't know why yet, but something inside her stirred, a flicker of defiance beneath the hurt. The next morning, as she packed her bags to head back to Boston, her phone chimed once more. This time it was a number she did recognize. The message was simple, direct. "I heard what she said. James, the beggar, she's forcing you to marry. Meet me tomorrow at the coffee shop on Maple Street. Not what she thinks. Clara frowned, rereading the words. A beggar texting her? It dull makes sense, but there was something in the tone, a quiet confidence that tugged at her curiosity. She drove the 2 hours back to Boston in a daze, Margaret's laughter echoing in her ears. When she pulled into her driveway, she sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. Who was this James? Why would he reach out? And why did her heart, bruised as it was, feel a tiny spark of hope at the thought of meeting him? She stepped out of the car, clutching her phone, and made a decision. Tomorrow she would go. Tomorrow she would face whatever this strange twist of fate had in store. Inside her apartment, she dropped her bag and sank onto the couch, the live stream still looping in her mind. She imagined confronting Margaret, imagined shouting back, "You think empathetic? Look at what I've done for you." But the words felt hollow. Margaret wouldn't care. She never had. Clara pulled a blanket over her knees and stared at the sketches on her wall, faded pencil lines of a life she had abandoned. Maybe this beggar, this James, was just another humiliation Margaret had cooked up. Or maybe, just maybe, he was something else entirely. As the night deepened, Clara whispered to herself, "I've spent so long trying to prove enough, to her, to everyone. What if wrong? What if there's more out there, something I can't even imagine?" She did have answers, but for the first time in years she felt a pull, a longing that, once tied to duty or guilt, it was tied to a stranger named James and the promise of a meeting that might change everything. The next morning dawned gray and chilly over Boston, the kind of day that made Clara want to pull the covers back over her head and forget the world. But she couldn't. That text from James, the beggar her stepmother had mocked her into marrying, lingered in her mind like a half-remembered dream. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, brushing her dark hair into a loose ponytail, her hazel eyes staring back with a mix of dread and curiosity. What was she doing? Meeting a stranger who claimed to be part of Margaret's cruel plan? She tugged on a navy sweater and jeans, grabbed her keys, and headed out before she could talk herself out of it. The coffee shop on Maple Street was a small, weathered place tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat. Its windows were fogged with steam, and the scent of roasted beans spilled onto the sidewalk as Clara pushed open the door. She scanned the room, her heart thudding against her ribs. A few regulars sat with newspapers, a barista hummed behind the counter, and then she saw him. He was at a corner table, hunched over a chipped mug, wearing a faded hoodie with frayed sleeves. His hair was a mess of dark curls and stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked every bit the beggar Margaret had described, yet there was something in the way he sat, a quiet stillness, that didn't fit the picture. Clara approached, her boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. He looked up as she neared, and his eyes, a deep gray like storm clouds, locked onto hers. "You're Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, not a question but a statement. She nodded, sliding into the chair across from him. "James," he continued, setting his mug down. "I heard what your stepmother said on that live stream. Sorry you had to go through that." She studied him, unsure what to make of this man who seemed both rough and gentle at once. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "If you're part of her scheme, just tell me now and save us both the time." James leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not her pawn, if that's what you think. She found me on the street, offered me $20 to play along and marry you. Said it would teach you a lesson. But I'll take her money, and am not here to hurt you." Clara frowned, crossing her arms. "Then why agree to meet me? What's in it for you?" His smile faded, and for a moment he looked past her, out the window at the drizzle streaking the glass. "I know what it's like to be unseen," he said quietly, "to have someone tear you down when you've given everything. I heard her call you pathetic, and it hit me harder than it should have. I guess I wanted to see who you really are, not the version she painted." His words caught her off guard, slipping past the walls she had built around her heart. She wanted to push back, to tell him he don't know her, that he had no right to assume anything. but instead she found herself saying, "You don't even know me. Why would you care?" James met her gaze again, unflinching. "Because I've been where you are, lost, unseen, and I'd give anything to feel seen again. Maybe with you?" The air between them shifted, heavy with something unspoken. Clara felt her cheeks warm, her pulse quickening. She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her sleeve. In her mind, she whispered to herself, "His words wrapped around me like a warm blanket on a freezing night. Could someone really see me? Not the broken girl Margaret painted, but me?" My heart raced, and for the first time in years, I wanted to believe in something or someone. She cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "So, what now? You said you're not what she thinks. What does that mean?" James hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I wasn't always like this," he said. "I used to have a different life, a big one, money, a company, a penthouse overlooking the harbor. But I lost someone, and it broke me. I walked away from it all 3 years ago, started living on the streets by choice. Margaret saw a ragged man and assumed the worst. She has no idea who I really am." Clara blinked, processing his words. "You're saying you were rich, and you gave it up? Why?" He shrugged, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of pain, because none of it mattered after she was gone. "The woman I loved died in a car accident, and I couldn't face the world we'd built together. I thought disappearing would make it easier. It didn't." Her chest tightened at the rawness in his voice. She knew loss, knew the way it hollowed you out. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I lost my dad 5 years ago. It changed everything." James nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. For a moment they sat there, two strangers bound by grief, the hum of the coffee shop fading into the background. Then he straightened, a spark lighting his gaze. "Here's my offer," he said. "Let's play along with Margaret's plan. Let her think she's won. We'll pretend to go through with this marriage, give her the satisfaction. But really, it'll be our secret. A way to take back what she tried to steal from you." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And what do I get out of it?" He smiled again, softer this time. "You get to see her squirm when she realizes she misjudged us both. And maybe along the way we figure out if there's more to this than just a game." She should have said no. It was reckless, absurd, a plan born from spite and desperation. But something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, made her pause. She thought of Margaret's smirk, the laughter of her family, the years she had spent shrinking herself to fit their expectations. And then she thought of herself, standing in that hotel room longing for something more. "Okay," she said at last. "I'm in, but don't expect me to make this easy for you." James chuckled, the sound warm and unexpected. "I wouldn't dream of it." They shook hands across the table, his grip firm, his skin rough against hers. As she pulled away, her fingers tingled, and she wondered what she had just agreed to. In her mind, she murmured. His laugh was like sunlight breaking through clouds, and I felt it, a pull I couldn't name. Was this madness or the start of something I had dare hope for? They spent the next hour talking, tentative at first, then easier. He asked about her job, her favorite houses to sell, the way she could read a client's dreams in their eyes. She asked about his past, the company he wouldn't name, the life he had left behind. By the time they finished their coffee, the drizzle outside had stopped, and the world felt a little less heavy. As they stood to leave, James touched her arm lightly. "Tomorrow," he said. "Meet me at the old house on Elm Street. I want to show you something." Clara nodded, her heart thudding again. "Tomorrow," she echoed. She walked home through the damp streets, the city lights reflecting in puddles at her feet. Her mind replayed his words, his touch, the strange warmth that had settled in her chest. She didn't know what James was hiding or why he had chosen her to share this secret, but for the first time in years, she felt alive, not just surviving but reaching for something new. As she unlocked her apartment door, she whispered to herself, "He sees me, really sees me, and I don't know if I'm ready for that or if I'll ever be. But tomorrow, I'll find out." The next day, Clara woke to sunlight streaming through her apartment window. a rare brightness that mirrored the flutter in her chest. She couldn't shake James from her thoughts, his gray eyes, his quiet strength, the way he had seen her when she felt invisible. She pulled on a soft green jacket and headed to Elm Street, her steps quickening with each block. The old house he'd mentioned stood at the end of a quiet lane, its paint peeling, its windows boarded up. It was the kind of place she'd sell to a dreamer with a vision, not a beggar with nothing to his name. Yet there he was, waiting on the sagging porch, a toolbox at his feet. "Morning," he said, his voice warm as he stood to greet her. "Glad you came." Clara tilted her head, eyeing the house. "What is this place?" James grinned, a boyish spark in his expression. "My project. Been fixing it up for months. Come inside, I'll show you." She followed him through the creaking door, stepping into a world of dust and possibility. The floors were scuffed, the walls cracked, but there was a beauty in its bones, a skeleton of something waiting to be revived. He led her to the living room where a tarp covered the floor and cans of paint sat in a neat row. "I started this after I walked away from everything," he said, picking up a brush. "It was a way to keep my hands busy, my mind quiet." Clara watched him, the way his fingers gripped the handle with purpose. "And now?" she asked. "What's it for?" He turned to her, his gaze steady. "Now it's for us. A place to start our little rebellion against Margaret. Pick a color, let's make it ours." She hesitated, then chose a soft blue, the shade of a summer sky. They painted side by side, strokes overlapping, silence settling comfortably between them. As the wall transformed, Clara felt something shift inside her, a piece of the artist she'd buried clawing its way back. She glanced at James, his hoodie speckled with paint, and her heart stumbled. In her mind, she murmured, "His hands brushed mine as we painted, and I felt a spark I'd forgotten existed." Was this what love felt like? Not sacrifice, not duty, but this quiet, beautiful chaos blooming between us? They talked as they worked, words flowing like the paint. She told him about her sketches, the ones she hid in her apartment, the dreams she'd let fade. He listened, really listened, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why'd you stop?" he asked at last. Clara sighed, dipping her brush. "Margaret? After Dad died, she needed me. I thought if I took care of her, she'd see me, love me. But she never did." James set his brush down, stepping closer. "You're not pathetic, Clara. I see someone who's carried the world on her shoulders and still hasn't broken. That's strength, not failure." Her breath caught, his words sinking deep. She wanted to argue, to say he was wrong, but the sincerity in his voice stopped her. Instead, she whispered, "Why did you give it all up? The money, the life?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because none of it mattered without her. Emily, my fiancée. She died, and I couldn't stay in that world without her. Until I met you. You make me want to start again, Clara." She swallowed, her throat tight. "I've spent so long running from myself. With you, I feel like I can finally stop." The air grew thick, charged with something neither dared name. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, then pulled back as if afraid to break the moment. Clara smiled faintly, picking up her brush again. "Let's keep going," she said, her voice soft. They painted until the sun dipped low, the room glowing with their shared effort. As they stepped back to admire it, James turned to her. "This is just the beginning, you know." She nodded, her heart whispering, "Yes, it is." But the world outside wouldn't let them linger in peace. That evening, Clara's phone buzzed with a notification from Lily. She'd opened it to find a new post from Margaret on social media, a public rant that made her stomach drop. "My stepdaughter's so desperate she's marrying a beggar. Pathetic girl, can't do better, and I'm the one who had to fix her mess." The comments piled up, some laughing, some pitying, all stabbing at Clara's fragile hope. She sank onto her couch, the phone slipping from her hand. In her mind she thought, "She won't stop, will she? Even now she's turning this into a weapon. What am I doing letting James into this mess?" She didn't tell him about the post, not yet. The next day she met him at the house again, determined to keep their secrets safe. They painted another room, this time in a warm yellow, and he told her stories of his old life, the deals he'd closed, the places he'd seen. She laughed, a sound that felt foreign and free, and he watched her with a softness that made her ache. "You've got a beautiful laugh," he said, almost to himself. She blushed, brushing hair from her face. "Haven't had much reason to use it lately." He stepped closer, his voice low. "I'd like to change that." Her pulse raced and she looked up at him, his face inches from hers. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and she wanted him to, more than she'd admit. But he pulled back, clearing his throat. "We've got a plan to stick to, right?" he said, a teasing edge to his tone. Clara nodded, hiding her disappointment. "Right. The plan." They finished the day with the room half-painted, a promise of more to come. Over the next week, they met whenever she wasn't working, turning the house into a canvas of their defiance. Margaret's taunts continued, each post sharper than the last, but Clara kept them from James, afraid to taint what they were building. She'd catch herself watching him as he hammered a loose board or sanded a rough edge, his focus drawing her in. In her mind, she confessed, "I'm falling for him, aren't I? This man who should be a stranger, who's turning my world upside down. I should stop, but I don't want to." One afternoon, as rain pattered against the roof, they sat on the floor with takeout coffee, the house quiet around them. James looked at her, his expression serious. "Why do you keep doing it?" he asked. "Helping her, even after everything?" Clara traced the rim of her cup. "Because I thought it's what family does. I thought if I gave enough, she'd love me back. But I was wrong." He reached for her hand, his touch tentative but firm. "You don't have to prove anything to her, or to me. You're enough, Clara, just as you are." Her eyes stung, his words unraveling years of doubt. She squeezed his hand, letting it linger. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." He smiled, a real one that lit up his face. "Always." They sat there, hands clasped, the rain a soft soundtrack to a moment that felt like a turning point. Clara knew then that this wasn't just a game anymore. It was real, fragile, and growing stronger every day. As she walked home that night, the city lights blurred through the drizzle. She felt lighter than she had in years. Margaret's words still stung, but they held less power now. James was her shield, her spark, and she wouldn't let her stepmother take that away. In her mind, she murmured, "He's waking something in me, something I thought was lost, and I'll fight for it, for us, no matter what comes next." The days slipped by in a haze of paint and quiet moments, each one weaving Clara and James closer together. The old house on Elm Street was no longer just a shell. It was their haven, a place where the world's noise faded and something tender took root. Clara found herself counting the hours until she could see him again, her real estate work blurring into the background. She'd catch herself smiling at odd times, a warmth spreading through her that she hadn't known in years. But beneath it all, Margaret's shadow loomed, her social media jabs growing louder, more vicious. Clara kept them hidden from James, tucking her phone away whenever he was near, afraid to let her stepmother's poison touch what they'd built. That Friday, Clara hosted a real estate auction downtown, a high-stakes event she'd spent weeks preparing for. It was held in a sleek hotel ballroom, all glass walls and polished floors, packed with Boston's elite buyers and sellers. She wore a charcoal dress that hugged her frame, her hair swept up, feeling more like herself than she had in ages. The auction was her chance to shine, to prove she was more than Margaret's punching bag. She moved through the crowd with confidence, calling out bids, her voice steady as properties changed hands. The room buzzed with energy, and for once, she felt in control. Then she saw him. James stepped through the double doors, but he wasn't the man she knew. Gone was the frayed hoodie, the stubble, the quiet beggar of Elm Street. He wore a tailored black suit, his curls tamed, his presence commanding the room. Whispers rippled through the crowd as heads turned, recognition flickering in their eyes. Clara froze mid-sentence, the gavel trembling in her hand. Who was this man? He caught her gaze and smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips, before striding to the front. The next item was a small Victorian house on Beacon Hill, one Clara had always loved. Its stained glass and ivy-covered walls, a piece of her childhood dreams. Bidding started at 200,000, climbing fast. Then James raised his hand. 5 million, he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. The room went silent, every eye on him. Clara's breath hitched. 5 million? For a house worth half that? The auctioneer stammered. Sold to Mr. James Harrington. Harrington. The name hit her like a wave. James Harrington. The reclusive billionaire who'd vanished from Boston's business scene years ago. She finished the auction in a daze, her mind spinning as the crowd dispersed. James waited by the podium, his hands in his pockets, watching her with that same steady gaze. When the last guest left, she marched up to him, her voice low. "James Harrington? Hear him? The billionaire?" He nodded, unapologetic. "I was. Still am, I suppose. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to change this, us." Clara shook her head, anger and awe warring inside her. "You let me think you were nothing, a beggar. Why?" He stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "Because I needed to know you saw me. Not the money, not the name. I've lived with people who only cared about what I could give them. You didn't. You saw the man under the mess. And that's why I'm here." She opened her mouth to argue, but the truth in his eyes stopped her. In her mind, she whispered, "He's been hiding this all along, and yet it makes sense. That quiet strength, that unshakable calm, it was never a beggar's mask. It was him." Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the room. "Clara!" She turned to see Margaret storming in, her face twisted with fury, Lily trailing behind with wide eyes. "I heard you were here," Margaret snapped. "Parading around like you're somebody. Where's that filthy beggar you're so proud of?" Clara's heart sank, but James stepped forward, his tone cool. "That would be me, Margaret, though I'm not quite what you expected, am I?" Marguerite's jaw dropped, her eyes darting between his suit and the whispers still lingering in the air. "You're lying," she sputtered. "You're a nobody, a street rat I picked to teach her a lesson." James raised an eyebrow. "A nobody with a net worth that could buy this hotel twice over. Check the papers, Mrs. Evans. I'm James Harrington, and I just bought that house for Clara. It's hers now, free and clear." Clara's knees weakened, her gaze snapping to him. "For me?" she breathed. He nodded, a flicker of a smile on his lips. "You said it was your dream. I wanted you to have it." Margaret recovered, her voice shrill. "This is ridiculous. Clara, tell him he's insane. You're not worth this." Clara straightened, years of hurt boiling over. "No, Margaret, you're the one who's wrong. You wanted me to marry a beggar to humiliate me. Now you see he's more than you'll ever be. I'm done with your games." Margaret's face reddened, but before she could retort, James took Clara's hand, his grip warm and sure. The crowd had gathered again, drawn by the drama, and he turned to them, raising his voice. "I have one more bid tonight. Clara Evans, I came into this thinking I'd play a part, but you changed everything. You brought me back to life when I thought I'd lost it all. Marry me, not for revenge, not for anyone else, but because I can't imagine my life without you." The room held its breath, every eye on her. Clara's heart pounded, her hand trembling in his. She looked into his eyes, those storm-gray depths that had seen her from the start, and everything fell into place. In her mind, she cried. The crowd faded, and it was just us, two broken souls who'd found each other in the wreckage. My heart screamed yes before my lips could catch up. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady despite the tears. "Yes, James, because you saw me when no one else did." A cheer erupted, drowning out Margaret's furious protests. Lily rushed forward, hugging Clara with a grin. "I knew it," she laughed. "I filmed the whole thing. It's going viral already." Margaret stormed out, her heels clicking a retreat, but Clara barely noticed. James pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, and she pressed her face to his chest, breathing him in. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. He tilted her chin up, his thumb brushing her cheek. "I did. Because you're worth it, Clara, every bit of it." They stood there, the world spinning around them, and she felt a peace she hadn't known was possible. The house on Beacon Hill was hers, a gift born from his love, but it was his heart she wanted most. In her mind, she thought, "He's given me more than a house, more than a name. He's given me a future I never dared dream of, and I'll hold on to it with everything I have." As they left the ballroom hand in hand, the city lights glittered outside, a promise of what lay ahead. Margaret's plan had backfired, her cruelty exposed, but Clara didn't care about revenge anymore. She had James, and he had her, two lost souls who'd found their way together. The truth of who he was had changed everything, not because of the money, but because of the man he'd shown himself to be. And as they stepped into the night, she knew this was only the beginning of their story. The weeks after the auction passed in a blur of joy and quiet transformation. Clara stood in the Victorian house on Beacon Hill, her house now, its stained glass windows casting rainbow patterns across the hardwood floors. James had handed her the keys that night, his smile soft as he'd said, "It's yours, Clara. Make it everything you've ever wanted." She'd walked through the rooms alone at first, tracing the walls with her fingertips, imagining the life she could build here. But it wasn't just the house that felt like a gift. It was him, the man who'd seen her when she'd forgotten how to see herself. They married a month later in that same house, a small ceremony with only a handful of guests. Lily was there, beaming as she filmed every moment, her live stream capturing the vows they'd written by hand. Clara wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in her hands. James stood across from her in a gray suit, his eyes never leaving hers. "I was lost before you," he said, his voice steady. "You gave me a reason to come back, to live again. I promise to love you, not just with words, but with every choice I make." Clara's throat tightened as she replied, "You saw me when I was invisible. You gave me back my dreams, my heart. I promise to stand by you, always." The guests clapped, a soft murmur of celebration filling the room, but Clara barely heard it. She reached for his hand, their fingers lacing together, and in her mind she whispered, "This is home, not the house, not the city, but him. The girl once called pathetic has found her strength, her love, her everything." They kissed, a tender press of lips that sealed a future neither had dared imagine, and the weight of her past slipped away like dust in the wind. Life settled into a rhythm after that, one Clara hadn't known she could have. She opened an art studio in the house's sunlit attic, shelves lined with paints and canvases, her sketches finally free from their hiding place. James helped her sand the floors, hang lights, his hand steady beside hers. He'd returned to his old world in pieces, taking calls with investors, rebuilding what he'd left behind, but he always came home to her, his tie loosened, his smile tired but real. They'd sit on the porch at dusk, coffee mugs in hand, watching Boston fade into twilight. Margaret's presence lingered at first, a shadow Clara couldn't fully shake. Lily had sent the wedding video viral, millions watching as Margaret's lies unraveled. The family turned on her, whispers of her cruelty spreading until she was left alone, her taunts silenced. She'd moved in with an aunt, her posts stopped, her voice muted by the truth. Clara didn't gloat, didn't need to. She'd won something greater than revenge. She'd won herself. One evening, as summer bled into fall, they stood on the balcony overlooking the city. The air was crisp, the skyline a tapestry of gold and shadow. James slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "I thought love was a dream I'd lost forever," she said, her voice soft against the breeze. "You gave it back to me." He pressed his lips to her temple, his breath warm. "And you gave me a reason to live again. We're not just survivors, Clara. We're each other's miracle." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and felt a peace that rooted deep. In her mind, she murmured, "He's my anchor, my light. I spent so long chasing approval I didn't deserve, but with him, I don't have to chase anything. I'm enough." They stood there, wrapped in each other, the city humming below, a testament to the life they'd carved out together. Months later, Clara hung her first painting in a local gallery, a swirl of blues and yellows inspired by their days in the Elm Street house. The opening night drew a crowd, art lovers and clients mingling as she stood by James's side, his hand on her back. A critic approached, praising her work, and she smiled, a quiet pride blooming in her chest. This was her dream, reborn from the ashes of sacrifice, and he'd been there every step. "Thank you," she whispered to him as the night wound down. "For what?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "For believing in me," she said, "for loving me into this." He pulled her close, his voice a murmur against her ear. "I'll always believe in you, Clara. You're my heart." She kissed him then, soft and slow, the gallery lights dimming around them. In her mind, she thought, this is what love is. Not a burden, not a chain, but a freedom I never knew I could claim. And I'll hold it forever. One afternoon, as she painted in the attic, her phone rang, the screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. She answered, cautious, and heard a voice she hadn't expected. "Clara, it's Lily. I've got news. Margaret saw your gallery feature online. She's been quiet since, but I think she's finally getting it, what she lost." Clara paused, brush in hand, waiting for the old ache to surface. It didn't. "Thanks, Lily," she said. "I hope she finds her way." She hung up, her heart steady, the past a faint echo she no longer feared. James climbed the attic stairs a moment later, leaning against the doorframe with a grin. "How's my artist?" he teased. She laughed, setting her brush down. "Better now that you're here." He crossed the room, wrapping her in his arms, and she sank into him, the scent of his cologne grounding her. They'd built this life from scraps, from pain, from a love neither had seen coming. In her mind, she murmured, "I was broken once, lost in someone else's story. Now I'm whole, writing my own with him." As winter approached, they hosted a small gathering in the Beacon Hill house, friends and family filling the rooms with laughter. Lily toasted them, her glass raised, to Clara and James, who turned a cruel joke into a love story for the ages. Cheers rang out, and Clara met James's gaze across the table, a silent promise passing between them. Later, as the fire crackled and guests drifted home, they curled up on the couch, her head on his chest. "I love you," she said, the words simple but vast. "I love you too," he replied, his hand tracing circles on her back. The house settled around them, its walls holding their story, a tapestry of resilience and redemption. Clara closed her eyes, listening to his heartbeat, and knew this was her forever. She'd been mocked, diminished, forced into a corner by a woman who'd never truly known her, but from that darkness, she'd found light, a love that lifted her higher than she'd ever dreamed. In her mind, she whispered, "I'm not the girl I was. I'm his, he's mine, and together, we're unstoppable." The city slept beyond their windows, a quiet witness to their journey. Clara Evans, once a shadow of herself, had stepped into the sun, her art, her love, her life a testament to what she'd reclaimed. And as she drifted to sleep in James's arms, she smiled, knowing the best was yet to come.